Rick wiped the sweat from his forehead as he placed the last gleaming pot on its hook. After 3 months of paperwork, equipment checks, and endless safety inspections, his restaurant, Earth Flavors, was finally ready to open on Galactic Station 7. The metallic walls of his kitchen reflected the warm lighting, making the space feel almost like his old restaurant back in Texas. Outside his kitchen window, he could see the popular alien restaurant, Pure Essence, where Chef Vex was preparing his famous nutrient spheres. The tall, blue-skinned alien moved with practiced grace, his 4 arms operating various molecular synthesizers. Rick had tried to be friendly with his restaurant neighbor, but Vex had made his feelings about human cooking very clear. "You actually touch your food with appendages?" Vex had asked during their first meeting, his upper eyes narrowing in disgust, while his lower ones examined Rick's hands. "And you expose nutrients to extreme temperatures. How primitive." Rick had learned that most advanced species in the galaxy had evolved beyond what they called crude consumption methods. They created perfectly balanced nutrient spheres using molecular synthesis, considering traditional cooking barbaric. The morning of his grand opening, Rick started preparing his mother's famous beef stew. The smell of garlic and onions sizzling in butter filled the kitchen. Through the window, he noticed Vex and several other aliens gathering, their faces showing various signs of alarm. The door chimed, and Station Security Officer Mel floated in, her gelatinous form rippling with concern. "Chef Rick, we've received multiple reports of possible chemical warfare from your establishment." Rick couldn't help but laugh. "That's just onions caramelizing, officer. It's perfectly safe. Would you like to try some?" Before Mel could respond, Vex burst through the door, all 4 arms waving in agitation. "This is unacceptable. You're releasing volatile organic compounds into a public space. I can see actual particle matter floating in the air." "Those are just herbs and spices, Chef Vex," Rick explained patiently. "They're what give food its flavor." "Flavor?" Vex spat the word like it was poison. "Proper nutrition requires no such primitive additions. My nutrient spheres contain perfectly balanced elements for optimal biological function." By now, a small crowd had gathered outside. Some aliens watched in horror as Rick stirred the pot, while others showed curious interest in the strange smells. Officer Mel extended a tentacle toward the pot, her surface rippling with intrigue. "It does produce an unusual sensory response in my olfactory receptors." "That's called smelling good," Rick said with a smile. He offered her a small spoon of the stew broth. The entire room went silent as Mel absorbed the liquid into her body. Her transparent form suddenly lit up with swirling colors, a reaction Rick had never seen in her species before. This is, she struggled to find words. "I require a full portion. For security purposes, of course." Vex watched in horror as Mel happily consumed a bowl of stew, her body continuing to display a light show of pleased reactions. "This is an outrage. You're corrupting pure biological functions with your primitive methods." He stormed out, all 4 fists clenched. Rick just smiled and continued cooking. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of a very interesting cultural exchange. A week after the opening of Earth Flavors, Rick prepared for his first live cooking demonstration on Galactic Station 7. He had set up a simple grill outside his restaurant, attracting a crowd of curious aliens who had never seen actual fire used in food preparation. Vex stood at the edge of the gathering, his blue skin turning slightly darker with stress as he watched Rick place seasoned steaks on the hot grill. The sizzling sound made several aliens jump back, and the smell of cooking meat drew both fascinated and horrified reactions. "He's burning perfectly good protein structures," Vex announced loudly to anyone who would listen. "This is destruction of nutrients, not food preparation." His 4 arms were crossed in different patterns of disapproval. Rick ignored the comments and continued his work, sprinkling herbs and spices over the meat. He had learned that most alien species considered spices completely unnecessary, as their taste buds had evolved to prefer pure, synthesized nutrients. The concept of adding flavoring to food was as strange to them as eating plain nutrient paste was to humans. "What are those colored powders?" asked a small, tentacled alien child who had wiggled to the front of the crowd. "These are spices," Rick explained, holding up his collection of containers. Humans discovered thousands of years ago that certain plants could make food taste better. "This one is black pepper, this is garlic powder, and this is paprika." The child's parent pulled it back quickly. "Don't get too close. Those could be toxic." Officer Mel, who had become a regular customer, floated forward. "Actually, I've consumed these substances in Chef Rick's stew. They cause no harm, only interesting sensations." Her gelatinous form sparkled with pleased colors as she remembered the experience. The demonstration continued, and the smell of grilling steaks began to draw more station residents. Even some of the station's maintenance robots stopped their work to observe the unusual process. Rick noticed that Vex, despite his vocal disapproval, hadn't left and was watching intently as the steaks were flipped. When the steaks were done, Rick let them rest before cutting into one to show the perfect pink center. Several aliens gasped at the sight. "The protein isn't even fully denatured," Vex exclaimed in horror. "It's still raw in the middle." "That's how we like it," Rick said with a smile, plating the sliced steak with a side of grilled vegetables. "Would anyone like to try?" To everyone's surprise, Officer Mel was the first to volunteer again. As she absorbed a piece of steak, her transparent body erupted in a dazzling display of colors, more vibrant than even her reaction to the stew. "The texture, the flavor combinations. It's unlike anything in our culinary database," she announced, her voice rippling with excitement. One by one, brave aliens stepped forward to taste the grilled meat. Their reactions ranged from shocked pleasure to confused enjoyment. Rick noticed that Vex had moved closer, all four eyes fixed on the remaining steak pieces. "Would you like to try some, Chef Vex?" Rick offered. Vex straightened up indignantly. "Certainly not. I merely wish to document this violation of proper nutrient preparation protocols." But his eyes never left the plate, and Rick could have sworn he saw one of Vex's hands make an involuntary reaching motion before being quickly pulled back. The demonstration ended with a small line forming at Rick's restaurant door, while Vex stormed back to his own establishment, muttering about primitive cooking methods. But Rick noticed that before leaving, the alien chef had taken several scans of his grill with a hidden sensor. The dining hall of Galactic Station 7 buzzed with excitement as Vex stood on the central platform, his blue skin practically glowing under the station's lights. All four of his arms were raised dramatically as he made his announcement. "I, Chef Vex of Pure Essence, formally challenge the human Rick to a culinary competition." His voice boomed through the hall. "We shall determine, once and for all, whether his primitive cooking methods have any merit in modern galactic society." The crowd of various alien species murmured and clicked in excitement. Food competitions were rare in galactic society, as most species had evolved beyond the concept of cooking. Nutrient preparation was considered a precise science, not an art. Rick stood from his table, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He had been in the middle of eating his lunch when Vex burst in. "And who would judge this competition?" "Chef Vex. Most species here can't even taste what I cook the same way humans do." Vex's upper eyes narrowed while his lower ones gleamed with satisfaction. "The station's Food Safety and Nutrition Council will judge, all 7 members, representing different species, with their advanced taste receptors and molecular analysis capabilities." Rick knew the council, a group of serious officials who usually spent their time ensuring that all station food met basic safety standards for all species. They were notorious for preferring bland, scientifically optimized nutrient solutions. "And the terms?" Rick asked, standing up. 3 dishes each, served to the council in their official chamber. The winner's cooking method will be officially recognized as superior, and Vex paused for dramatic effect. "The loser must close their restaurant." The crowd gasped. Even Officer Mel, floating near the ceiling, rippled with shock. Rick thought about his tiny restaurant, about the growing number of aliens who had begun to appreciate human cooking. He thought about his grandmother's recipes, passed down through generations. Then he looked at Vex's smug face and made his decision. "I accept," Rick said firmly. "On one condition. We both have to eat each other's dishes as well." This time, it was Vex who looked shocked. His forearms twitched nervously before he responded. "Agreed. The competition will be held in 3 station cycles." As the crowd dispersed, excited chatter filling the hall, Officer Mel floated down to Rick's table. "Are you certain about this? The council members are very traditional. They might not understand human cooking." Rick smiled, already planning his menu. "Sometimes you have to risk everything to prove what you believe in." Besides, he added with a grin, "Did you notice how Vex's eyes kept drifting to the grilled vegetables on my plate while he was making his challenge?" Officer Mel's gelatinous form rippled with amusement. "Now that you mention it, I did scan some interesting chemical reactions in his brain patterns during his speech, very similar to what humans call hunger." Rick gathered his dishes, his mind already racing through recipes. He had 3 station cycles to prove that human cooking wasn't just about nutrition. It was about passion, creativity, and bringing people together. And somehow, he had to make 7 different alien species understand that through their taste receptors. "Well," he said to himself as he headed back to his kitchen, "nobody ever said being the first human chef in space would be easy." Rick stood in his kitchen, surrounded by ingredients he had specially imported from Earth. The competition was tomorrow, and he had finally decided on his strategy. His grandmother's lasagna recipe lay open on the counter, the paper worn and stained from decades of use. "You're really going to serve them pasta?" Officer Mel asked, hovering near the ceiling to avoid the steam from Rick's boiling pots. She had become his unofficial taste tester over the past weeks. "Not just pasta," Rick said, carefully layering the meat sauce. "This recipe has been in my family for 5 generations. It's got all 5 human taste sensations: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami." "Umami?" Mel's form rippled with curiosity. "Our database has no translation for this term." Rick smiled as he sprinkled fresh basil over the ricotta cheese layer. "That's because humans are one of the few species that can taste it. It's a savory, meaty flavor that comes from certain proteins. Most aliens never developed the ability to taste it because they evolved past natural food consumption too quickly." He had spent days studying alien biology texts. Most species had abandoned traditional eating thousands of years ago, their taste receptors becoming simplified to detect only basic nutritional value. But those receptors were still there, just dormant. "The judges won't even know what they're experiencing," Rick explained, adding another layer of pasta. "Their taste receptors will detect flavors they've never encountered before. The tomatoes provide umami and sweetness, the herbs add complexity, the cheese brings salt and more umami. And the garlic." He paused, adding an extra sprinkle of garlic powder. "Well, garlic just makes everything better." Officer Mel moved closer, her transparent form reflecting the kitchen lights. "But what if their systems reject it? Some species can't process certain Earth ingredients." "Already thought of that," Rick said, pointing to a datapad. "I've modified the recipe slightly. The meat is lab-grown to be safe for all known species, the cheese is made from plant proteins, and I've adjusted the acidity levels to be within universal safety standards." As he worked, he could see Vex in his restaurant across the way, all 4 arms operating various molecular synthesizers with precise movements. The alien chef was probably preparing his signature nutrient spheres, each one scientifically perfect in its nutritional balance. Rick put the final layer of cheese on top of his lasagna and stepped back to admire his work. It wasn't the prettiest dish. The layers were a bit uneven, and some sauce had bubbled up the sides. But he knew that's what made it special. It was imperfect, made by hand, with care and attention that no molecular synthesizer could match. "You know," he said, sliding the dish into the oven, I think this competition isn't really about whose food is better. It's about showing them that there's more to eating than just nutrition. Officer Mel's form pulsed with soft colors. What do you mean? Food isn't just fuel, Rick said, setting the timer. It's history, culture, love. Every time I make this lasagna, I remember Sunday dinners with my family. That's something you can't synthesize. The kitchen filled with the aroma of baking lasagna, and Rick noticed several aliens walking past his window paws, their sensory organs turning toward the smell. Even in space, hundreds of light years from Earth, the simple smell of home-cooked food still had the power to make people stop and wonder. The competition chamber hummed with anticipation as 7 council members sat at their elevated bench, their various species represented in an array of forms from crystalline to gaseous. Rick and Vex stood at separate cooking stations, their creations ready for judgment. Vex presented first, his nutrient spheres floating in perfect formation. Each was exactly identical, precise spheres glowing with a soft blue light. Behold, the pinnacle of nutritional science. Each sphere contains the exact molecular composition required for optimal biological function. The council members absorbed their samples with various methods, some dissolving them, others scanning them with specialized organs. Their approval was evident in their formal gestures. Then it was Rick's turn. He carefully placed a portion of lasagna before each judge, the steam carrying the rich aroma throughout the chamber. Several council members recoiled slightly at the sight. "What is this disorganized mass?" asked the crystalline council head, light refracting through their form in patterns of confusion. "This is lasagna," Rick said proudly, "a traditional Earth dish with multiple layers of—" "It's leaking," interrupted another council member, their gaseous form swirling in distress as sauce dripped from one layer. Rick noticed Vex's upper eyes showing satisfaction, while his lower ones studied the lasagna with hidden curiosity. The alien chef had yet to touch his required portion. The head council member extended a crystalline probe toward the dish. "We shall analyze for safety first." After a moment, they announced, "Basic safety standards are met. Proceed with consumption." The council members began to taste the lasagna, each in their own unique way. The crystalline one absorbed it through their surface, the gaseous one enveloped it, while others used various biological processes. The chamber fell completely silent. Then suddenly, the crystalline council head began to glow with intense colors, colors that rippled through their usually clear form in waves. The gaseous member expanded and contracted rapidly, their usual gray hue taking on swirls of purple and gold. What is happening to us?" one member asked, their voice vibrating with unexpected emotion. "These are flavor combinations we have never encountered," another added, their tentacles waving in agitation or excitement. Rick couldn't tell which. "The molecular structure is chaotic, yet harmonious," the head council member observed, still glowing with new colors. Rick watched as each council member experienced their first taste of real human cooking. Their reactions ranged from confusion to wonder, their bodies displaying various signs of sensory overload as dormant taste receptors awakened. Finally, all eyes turned to Vex, who still hadn't touched his portion. The blue alien chef looked at his perfect nutrient spheres, then at the messy lasagna. With visible reluctance, he used one of his 4 hands to take a small bite. Vex's reaction was immediate and dramatic. All 4 of his eyes widened, his blue skin flushed purple, and his arms went completely still, something Rick had never seen happen before. "This is—" Vex started, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words for the first time since Rick had met him. The chamber remained silent as everyone waited for the council's official verdict. But Rick didn't need to hear it. He could see it in their reactions. Something had changed today, and galactic cuisine would never be quite the same again. The station's science lab had never been so crowded. 3 days after the competition, a team of alien scientists huddled around various scanning devices, all focused on samples of Rick's lasagna. The council had demanded a full investigation into what they called the unprecedented gustatory phenomenon. Rick stood to one side, watching as different species of scientists waved scanners, probes, and what looked like glowing tentacles over his grandmother's recipe. Vex stood nearby, trying to appear disinterested, but failing to hide his curiosity. "Fascinating," exclaimed Dr. Pip, a spherical alien covered in sensing nodes. "The heating process has created entirely new molecular structures. The proteins and carbohydrates have undergone complex transformations." Another scientist, a tall crystalline being, chimed in. "Look at these readings. The interaction between the tomato compounds and herbs has produced flavor molecules that don't exist in any of our databases." "That's what cooking does," Rick explained. "Heat and combination of ingredients create new flavors. Humans discovered this thousands of years ago." "But this makes no logical sense," Vex interrupted, moving closer to examine a holographic display of the lasagna's molecular structure. "The chaotic combination of ingredients should result in reduced nutritional efficiency. Instead," he gestured with all four arms at the readings, "the bioavailability of certain compounds has actually increased." Dr. Pip bounced excitedly. "The process you call cooking has transformed simple compounds into complex flavor enhancers. The heat-induced chemical reactions have created something our synthesizers never could. Natural flavor compounds that interact with multiple taste receptors simultaneously." Rick watched as the scientists became increasingly animated. One was studying the Maillard reaction that occurred in the brown cheese. Another was analyzing the complex compounds created by the herbs and garlic, while a third was mapping how these elements combined to create what they termed a flavor cascade. "And look at this." Dr. Pip projected a larger image. "The thermal processing of these tomatoes has increased the availability of something called lycopene, while simultaneously creating new flavor compounds." Vex moved even closer, all four eyes fixed on the displays. "So you're saying that this primitive heating process actually improves both taste and nutrition?" He sounded both horrified and fascinated. "Improved taste is an evolutionary advantage," Rick explained. "Humans learned that food that tastes good is often more nutritious. That's why we developed cooking in the first place." The lab erupted in excited chatter as the scientists began discussing the implications. Some were already talking about studying other Earth cooking methods, while others were debating how to incorporate these principles into modern food synthesis. Rick noticed Vex had grown unusually quiet, all four arms crossed in deep thought. The alien chef was staring at a molecular diagram of the sauce-cheese interaction, as if it held the secrets of the universe. "You know," Rick said quietly to Vex, "there's room in the galaxy for both traditional cooking and modern synthesis. Sometimes the best innovations come from combining old and new methods." Vex's upper eyes narrowed, but his lower ones showed a glimmer of interest. Before he could respond, Dr. Pip bounced between them excitedly. "Chef Rick, could you demonstrate this cooking process again? We need to observe these chemical reactions in real time." As the scientists gathered around eagerly, Rick couldn't help but smile. Sometimes it took a room full of advanced alien scientists to prove that grandmother really did know best. The scene at Galactic Station 7's main promenade had changed dramatically over the past month. The sterile, orderly food dispensaries were now joined by cooking stations where alien chefs cautiously experimented with heat and natural ingredients. The air was filled with a mix of familiar and utterly alien cooking smells. Rick walked through the promenade, amazed at how things had evolved. A tentacled chef was carefully grilling what looked like blue vegetables, while a crystalline being used focused light beams to caramelize something that changed colors as it cooked. "Chef Rick," called out a familiar voice. Officer Mel floated down from her patrol route. "Have you seen what they're doing at Pure Essence?" Rick turned toward Vex's restaurant, expecting to see the usual molecular synthesizers. Instead, he stopped in surprise. Through the window, he could see Vex standing over what appeared to be a cooking surface, all four arms busy with different tasks. One stirred a pot, another adjusted temperature controls, while the remaining two measured ingredients. He's been experimenting for weeks, Mel explained, her form rippling with amusement. Ever since the science lab published their findings about human cooking methods, he's been trying to combine traditional synthesis with thermal processing. As they watched, Vex carefully poured his synthesized nutrient base into a pan. Instead of forming it into the usual perfect spheres, he was actually cooking it, adding what looked like earth spices to the mixture. The other day, Mel continued, he actually asked me where to find something called garlic. His voice synthesizer nearly crashed trying to pronounce it. Rick couldn't help but smile. Around the promenade, he could see other changes too. The usually rigid mealtimes had become more flexible as different species discovered the pleasure of casual dining. Some aliens had even started gathering in small groups to share meals, a concept that had been foreign to most species before. A small crowd had gathered outside Pure Essence, watching in fascination as Vex worked. His latest creation appeared to be some kind of fusion dish, a perfectly synthesized nutrient base transformed by heat and spices into something entirely new. You know what the best part is, Mel said, her form glowing with pleasure. Everyone's adapting it in their own way. The crystalline beings are using light refraction to cook. The plasma species are experimenting with energy field cooking. And yesterday I saw a gaseous chef using atmospheric pressure changes to create new textures. Rick watched as Vex plated his creation. No longer a perfect sphere, but something with actual texture and variation. The alien chef had even attempted to add what looked like a garnish. It's not about giving up their own food culture, Rick realized aloud. It's about expanding it, adding new possibilities. The station's food culture was evolving into something unique. Not quite human, not quite alien, but a true galactic cuisine. Traditional synthesis techniques were being combined with cooking methods from Earth and new techniques developed by various species. As Rick watched, Vex looked up from his work and caught his eye through the window. The alien chef's upper eyes showed professional acknowledgement, while his lower eyes held what Rick had learned to recognize as excitement. With one of his free hands, Vex made a small gesture, an invitation to come try his latest creation. Rick smiled and headed toward Pure Essence. Sometimes revolution came not with a bang, but with a simmer. 3 months after the competition, Rick and Vex stood side by side in their new shared kitchen. What had once been a wall between their restaurants was now an open space where human traditional cooking methods merged with alien molecular gastronomy. A little more heat on the synthesis chamber, Rick suggested, watching as Vex manipulated controls with 2 hands, while his other arms added earth spices to the mixture. They were perfecting their latest creation, a dish that combined synthesized alien proteins with traditional human cooking techniques. The molecular structure becomes unstable above certain temperatures, Vex replied, but adjusted the settings anyway. His former disgust for primitive cooking methods had evolved into scientific curiosity, and finally into genuine enthusiasm. Sometimes instability creates the best flavors, Rick said, stirring a pot of sauce that glowed with a soft blue light, a result of Vex's modified synthesis process. That's what makes cooking an art, not just a science. Their new restaurant, Fusion Universe, had become the talk of the galaxy. Food critics from 100 different species have visited, trying to understand how 2 seemingly opposite cooking philosophies could create something so revolutionary. The crystal beings are here again, Officer Mel announced. Floating through the kitchen entrance, she had become their unofficial maitre d', her ability to communicate with all species making her perfect for the role. They say the light refraction patterns in yesterday's dish gave them new sensory experiences. Vex's upper eyes showed pride while his lower ones focused on adding precisely measured herbs to the synthesis chamber. The combination of earth herbs and molecular gastronomy creates unique energy signatures. Watch this. He took the glowing sauce Rick had been stirring and ran it through a modified synthesizer. The sauce maintained its texture, but now shifted colors based on temperature, a visual indicator of when it was perfect to eat. Remember when you thought touching food was barbaric? Rick laughed, plating their latest creation. The dish looked like a work of art. Part perfectly structured molecular gastronomy, part rustic earth cooking. Remember when you thought molecular synthesis was soulless? Vex countered, all four eyes crinkling in what Rick had learned was his species' version of a smile. Their success had inspired others. Across the station, new fusion restaurants were opening. Some combined Venusian vapor cuisine with Earth barbecue techniques. Others merged Martian mineral gastronomy with Asian stir-fry methods. The galaxy was discovering that food could be both scientifically perfect and emotionally satisfying. Next week's special? Vex asked, already working on calculations for a new molecular structure. I was thinking about my mom's old meatloaf recipe, Rick said, but we could use your synthesized protein base and maybe add those color-changing spices from Centauri Beta. Meatloaf. All four of Vex's eyes blinked in sequence. That sounds chaotically intriguing. As they worked, the kitchen filled with an impossible mixture of smells. Earth spices mingling with alien aromas, traditional cooking scents blending with the clean efficiency of molecular gastronomy. Through the dining room windows, they could see beings of all species sitting together, sharing food and conversation. You know what? Rick said, watching their customers enjoy their food. Sometimes the best discoveries happen when you stop trying to prove which way is better and start exploring how different ways can work together. Vex nodded, all four arms busy with their next culinary experiment. Indeed, though I still say your method of caramelizing onions is completely illogical, says the chef who uses quantum mechanics to make gravy. Rick laughed. 1 year after Rick first opened his small Earth restaurant on Galactic Station 7, the dining hall was packed with beings from across the galaxy. The occasion was the first annual Galactic Culinary Convention, and Rick and Vex were the keynote speakers. Vex stood at the podium, his blue skin gleaming under the lights, all four arms gesturing as he spoke. A year ago, I stood in this very hall and challenged Chef Rick to a cooking competition. I was certain that my advanced molecular gastronomy would prove superior to his primitive methods. He paused, his upper eyes showing amusement. I have never been so happy to be wrong. The crowd, a colorful mix of various species, rippled with appreciative reactions. Officer Mel floated near the ceiling, her transparent form displaying proud colors. What I failed to understand then, Vex continued, was that food is more than just molecular composition and nutritional efficiency. Through human cooking, I learned that imperfection can create perfection, that chaos can lead to harmony, and that sometimes the most primitive methods can produce the most sophisticated results. Rick watched from his seat, remembering how far they'd come. Their restaurant had become famous not just for its food, but for what it represented, the beautiful possibilities that arose when different cultures came together with open minds. And now, Vex announced, Chef Rick, and I would like to share something special. He gestured to their serving staff, who began distributing small plates to everyone in the hall. This is a traditional Earth dessert called apple pie, prepared using a combination of human cooking methods and molecular gastronomy. Rick joined Vex at the podium as the attendees examined their plates. The pie looked deceptively simple, but its molecular structure had been modified to be safe and delicious for all known species. The apples had been traditionally cooked with cinnamon, but the latticework crust was created through molecular synthesis, achieving a perfect texture impossible through traditional methods alone. A year ago, Rick added, I couldn't have imagined serving apple pie to beings who thought cooking was barbaric. And Chef Vex couldn't have imagined willingly touching food with his hands. 3 hands, Vex corrected, holding up his fourth, which still operated a molecular synthesizer. Let's not get too primitive. The crowd laughed. As the various beings tasted the pie, the hall filled with a symphony of pleased reactions. Crystalline beings glowed with new colors, gaseous forms swirled in delight, and even the energy-based species pulsed with appreciation. Today, Vex concluded, we don't celebrate the victory of one cooking method over another. We celebrate the discovery that different doesn't mean better or worse. It just means we have more ways to create joy through food. Later that evening, after the speeches and celebrations, Rick and Vex sat in their empty restaurant, sharing a simple meal, half synthesized, half cooked, wholly delicious. You know, Vex said, using all four hands to eat in what had become his signature style, I still think fire is a dangerously unstable way to heat food. Rick grinned, taking a bite of his perfectly synthesized side dish. And I still think molecular synthesis takes all the fun out of cooking. They looked at each other and laughed, understanding that their differences had become their strength. Sometimes the best lessons come served with a slice of humble pie.